Hi friends, we at GLC would like to take a quick moment to thank you for watching our programs on this platform, and we'd like to ask you for a little favor. Would you please go beneath this video and click the subscribe button? Did you know that by simply subscribing to the GLC YouTube channel, you can help us financially support the programs on this platform? You'll need to be signed into YouTube beforehand, but if not, simply click the subscribe button and YouTube will automatically walk you through the steps to sign in or to create an account. By taking these simple steps, you will not only ensure that you continue to receive our unique programming and gain instant access to the hundreds of videos we post, but more importantly, you'll also be telling YouTube that GLC's content is worth watching and promoting. Likewise, if you enjoyed a specific program, please click the thumbs up button below, which also helps inform YouTube that this is a program worth recommending. Finally, once you have logged in and subscribed, please click the notification bell below in order to receive announcements when we post new content. As usual, feel free to post your questions and comments in the comments section below. We always love hearing from our friends and viewers. Again, thank you for watching and supporting God's Learning Channel. We couldn't spread the message of the gospel without you. Be blessed, and we hope you enjoy the show.
Shalom and welcome back to the Wild Branch Ministry. Welcome back to Paul Putting Words in My Mouth, where we are continuing our discussion on his comments about blotting out the handwriting of dogma that was against us. And as I said last week, we'll get into that in a little more detail. But last time we left off talking about him being the fullness of the Godhead bodily. And once again, keeping in mind that what Paul's trying to get across to us before we get to these comments is the difference between being in the man Yeshua, if you will, and in the other man. And that you are now out of that man, and now you are in the body of Messiah. And in the body of Messiah, and this is the way it's been true from the beginning, because the Messiah has been from the very beginning, there is neither Jew nor Gentile. I'm going to propose to you that that's really the way it's always been. In the body of Messiah, there's never been a difference between Jew and Gentile. Now, most people understand that in the body of Messiah that you are no longer a Jew. I mean, that's a pretty common thing, that when it's always been kind of seen that when someone who's ostensibly raised Jewish in a Jewish home and so on and so forth, and they have found the Messiah and so forth, that they're now in the body of Messiah, and now you don't do Jewish things anymore. Right? Some of you know what I'm talking about. You don't do those feasts, you don't do those Sabbaths, those are all Jewish things, and in the body of the Messiah, you do these things now. You do the Gentile things. But the problem is, in the body of Messiah, there's no longer Gentiles either. So you can't claim that Jewish believers are no longer Jewish, but Gentile believers are still Gentiles. You have to make up your mind one way or another. Because what the Father's trying to say is you are one new creation in Him now. And all the fullness of Him, of the God, of the Creator in the beginning, is in the body of Yeshua. And so there's not, if you will, not part of Him or a third of Him or a half of Him or only the part of Him from Matthew on and so forth. But I also think it's critical to say this, and I please want you to understand where my heart's coming from. Do not doubt for a minute that I believe that the Word of God became flesh and dwelt among us. And His name was Yeshua. Do not doubt that for a minute. But I do want to remind you, because we have a tendency in the body of Messiah to divide ourselves over issues concerning the nature of the Messiah. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Some use the phrase deity of Messiah or divinity of Messiah or something like that. We have those who believe He's the Messiah, but He's not God. We have those who believe He's the Messiah, but He's not God in the flesh. We have those that believe He's just a man. And then we have those that believe that He's, if you will, all God, if I can say that, and not man at all, or all man and not God at all. And so the tendency, I believe, of Greek thinking people is to dissect God like a frog in a biology lab. Put him on the plate there and kind of chop him all up and so forth and figure the whole thing out. But first of all, we're dealing with something that's infinitely far beyond our human capabilities to be able to understand anyway. We're the finite trying to understand the infinite and so forth. But I do want to remind you that this verse does not say that Yeshua is the fullness of the Godhead. That's putting words in Paul's mouth. That's not what Paul said. Paul said that in him dwelleth all the fullness of the Godhead bodily. And so there's a difference between those two statements I'm going to suggest to you. And that difference would limit, if you will, Yeshua's capability while he was dwelling among us in the flesh. That's what that limit would be. And I'm going to propose to you that this is my belief anyway, that God was perfectly capable, because he's God, because he's so awesome and infinitely awesome, that our Father, our God, our Creator is perfectly capable of taking upon flesh, dwelling among us, and yet still running the universe at the same time. I am not one of those, and I may do this to my own self-destruction, I am not one of those that believes that all of God was Yeshua walking here on earth. Which begs the question in the garden, well, was he praying to himself? See, my God is I don't put my God in that little box. My God's much bigger than that one. My God's perfectly capable of dwelling among us in the flesh, Yeshua, Yahweh in the flesh, and yet still being everywhere in the universe at the same time, and can light upon Yeshua as a dove and say from heaven, "This is my beloved Son." Now, what kind of God do you worship? Do you worship one that's capable of doing that? Or do you have one that you got to dissect on the biology lab and say, well, he can do this and he can't do this. This one's over here doing that thing and this one's over here doing that. My God is an all-powerful God which is perfectly capable of doing all those things. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I've joked about over the years, and I don't mean any disrespect to God, but I'm just trying to make a point, and that is that my God can be 31 cigar-smoking penguins if he wants to be. That's the nature of the God that I worship. Okay? Now that we've gotten through that silliness, I just want to remind you that he is the fullness of the Godhead bodily. And then he says, you are complete in him. Once again, showing the contrast between what you've come out of and what you're in now, and how because of what you are in now, the enemy is going to try to destroy that and is going to try to lead you after their traditions and their philosophies, and they're going to judge you when you do these things. Now let's go on, because in verse 11 he's going to remind them in verse 11 and 12, actually 11 through 13. He's going to remind them of something that Paul does all throughout his writings. Particularly when he's about to say and teach something that has to do with law and grace and things like that. Seems like he always gives a little gentle reminder to his audience. Don't forget why Yeshua died on the tree. And so he's going to say it once again. He's going to say it through the concept of baptism. He says, in whom also ye are circumcised with the circumcision made without hands. That's what made you a new creation in him. He's not talking about getting rid of physical circumcision. That's not the context. He's talking about the new man that's in Messiah is circumcised without hands. And he says, putting off the body of the sins of the flesh by the circumcision of the Messiah. Because he has made you clean, then you're putting off the body of sins, not the Torah. Because of the circumcision of the Messiah, you have not been freed from the Torah. You can now put off the body of sins of the flesh. Why? Because he's redeemed you from the penalty of that, which is death. Then he goes on to say, buried with him in baptism. This was shown when you did that. Wherein you were also risen with him through the faith of the operation of God who hath raised him from the dead. And of course, Paul is reminding us of what he said in Romans chapter 6 when he said that the old man has been buried now, and now a new man has risen that can now serve God in newness. That's what he's referring back to. Then in verse 13 he says, and you, being dead in your sins and the uncircumcision of your flesh, hath he quickened together with him, and has what? Forgiven you of all trespasses. Once again, he reminds you, because he's going to kind of give you a little image of this in something that happens when someone's arrested for a crime and put in prison. There's more than one thing going on here with this thing that Paul's going to teach us about the blotting out of handwriting of ordinances that was against us. Because he's also going to be using the image of someone who, when they were arrested and would be thrown in prison for a crime, that they would take the penalty for that crime and they would plaque it and write it up next on a placard next to the prison. And when they had finished serving the sentence, they would blot it out. Why? Because he paid the penalty for it. And so since all of us sin, and the wages of sin is death, because of what Yeshua has done, that's all been blotted out against us now. And so that's one of the images that he's also using there, and he's using this in this image of buried with baptism with him, and so on and so forth. Then he goes on to the famous verse in verse 14. Blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us. Let me switch to the next slide here. Which was contrary to us, and took it out of the way, nailing it to the cross. Now let's first talk about this first. Blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us. Now, the word blotting out there in Hebrew is machah. Machah. M-A-C-H-A-H. Machah. And it's used of sins, it's used of people. Let me give you a couple of examples of this word that's used in the Tanakh. In Genesis chapter 9, verse 15, it's used. Just want to give you a couple of examples. Genesis 9, verse 15. And here it says, and I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the water shall no more become a flood to destroy or blot out all flesh. In Exodus chapter 17, verse 14. Exodus 17, 14. This word blotting is what we're discussing here. 17:14 says, and Yahweh said unto Moses, write this for a memorial in a book, and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua, for I will utterly blot out, the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. And finally, Psalm 51. Psalm 51, another example of this word as it's used in the Tanakh. Psalm verse 51, verses 1 and 9, I believe I have here. Verse 1 says, have mercy upon me, O God, according to the loving kindness, according unto the multitude of your tender mercies, blot out my transgressions. So the context here is blotting out something. And here in Psalms, of course, it's blotting out my transgressions. So far, we haven't had any use of this word. As a matter of fact, I only gave you a couple of examples, but you can look these things up yourself. Do we have the blotting out of the Torah? Okay, that's not mentioned anywhere in the text. In verse 9 in chapter 51, he goes on to say that hide your face from my sins and blot out all my iniquities. So once again, the context of the blotting out has to do with your iniquities and your trespasses. Now, how do we know that that is the way it's used here in Colossians? Because we just read earlier where he said you're buried with him in baptism, and he hath quickened you together with him, having forgiven all your trespasses. And then he follows that with blotting out the handwriting of ordinances that was against us. Now, let's stop and talk a few minutes about this word ordinances, because the word that's used here in the Greek is going to be the same word that Paul's going to use. Paul uses this word several times, but particularly in Ephesians chapter 2, when he talks about the middle wall of partition. He uses specifically this word. This is one of the things that I love about the Greek language, because Greek is very specific in its use. It uses a specific word. Even though the nuance of that word may change just a little, it uses one word over another word for a particular reason. So the word that's translated here is dogma. Now, most of us understand what dogma is all about. Dogma is a word we use to describe the commandments and traditions of men, not God. Not one time in your Bible, anywhere from beginning to end, is the commandments of God ever called dogma. It's the traditions and the commandments and the ordinances of men that are called dogma. That is what's been blotted out against you. Why? Because you can keep God's ways. That's why in 1 John it says that His commandments are not burdensome. In the King James English, I believe it says, are not grievous. The commandments of our God are not grievous. They're not burdensome. It's man's interpretation or man's own commandments, additions and subtractions and so forth, that become burdensome. Those are the ones that are contrary to you. The Torah has never been contrary to you. It's a silly statement if you really think about that our fathers... Would you say that to your own father? Would you say that to your dad? If he told you to take out the trash? Would you say that, what you're telling me is burdensome? It's dogma. I don't want to do those things. And first of all, can you imagine telling your dad that, no, you don't have to do that anymore because you've been freed from that? Imagine the days of Noah, for example. The days of Noah. It says, because, we're familiar with the phrase in Romans chapter 6 where it says, we are no longer under the law, but under grace. And so the assumption is that means that because you're under grace now, you don't have to obey any of the commandments of God. That's the assumption, without any context, without any background from the beginning. That's the assumption that's made from that statement. But those are almost the very words said to Noah, for example. When you go back to Genesis chapter 6, it says Noah found grace in the eyes of God. So Noah was under grace. He found grace in the eyes of God. And so what did God say to Noah? He said to Noah, go build an ark. Can you imagine, given the consistency of what that means in our dominant religion in this country, can you imagine Noah saying to God, tell the Jew to make the ark. I'm freed from the law. I'm under grace now. Can you imagine that? To be consistent, I'm just being consistent, because if under grace means that I'm no longer under the law, and so Noah finds grace in the eyes of God, and then God tells him to do something, gives him a commandment, and Noah says, I'm freed from that commandment. Okay? Go tell the Jewish people to build the ark, okay, because I've been freed from that. You wouldn't do that with your father either. It's really kind of a silly statement. But what Paul is trying to teach us is that what we've been freed from and what's been blotted out is all those things that stand against us that were contrary to us, dogma. As a matter of fact, I'm going to give you the only two appearances of this Greek word dogma in the Septuagint. Now, the Septuagint, as many of you well know, is the Old Testament written in Greek. And it just so happens that this Greek word dogma does show up 2 times in your Old Testament. Now, once again, this is the one not only used here, showing that that's what's been blotted out. It's not the blotting out of the Torah. It's the blotting of dogma that was standing against you, of everybody else's interpretations of the commandments that constantly stands against you. And so Paul uses the same thing in Ephesians. In Ephesians chapter 2, you're familiar with this. He says, for by grace you're saved, 2 verse 8, you know that. You're familiar with that. And then in verse 11 he says, remember that in times past you were Gentiles in the flesh. In other words, if you're in the Commonwealth of Israel now, you're not Gentiles anymore. Okay? In times past you were, when you didn't know the Messiah. And then he goes on to say, but now in Messiah Yeshua. Paul's remaining absolutely consistent to everything he's teaching in Colossians. He's teaching here in Ephesians. And he says, now you're in the Messiah. You're not in the old man anymore. That old man was foreign to God and was outside the ways of our Creator. Now you're in Him and complete in Him, he just said. And then he goes on to say, you are His workmanship created in Him unto good works. And then he says, but now in Messiah, you who sometimes were far off are now made near by the blood of the Messiah. For He is our peace, who has made both one and has broken down the middle wall of partition between us, having abolished in His flesh the enmity. Now remember where the enmity starts? The enmity, guess what, is in the beginning. He is the one that is at enmity with the seed of the woman. The bad guy is who he's talking about here. He says, even the laws of commandments that are contained in dogma. So he's talking about laws and commandments contained in dogma, not contained in the Torah, not contained in the commandments of our God. But that has what has been broken down between you. And we will get into that in much more detail when we deal with this middle wall of partition later on, when we keep talking about things that are put in Paul's mouth and so forth. But I want to give you the only two times, the context of the only two times that this word is used. One in Ephesians chapter 2 here, and the other time in the blotting out of the handwriting of ordinances that was against us. The only two times it appears in the Old Testament at all. And let's go to both of them. The first one is in Daniel chapter 2, verse 13. I believe I quoted 2:14 just earlier, so I was real close to it in the first place. First occurrence, Daniel chapter 2, verse, let me see, make sure I've got the right one, 13. You all know the story. This is one of those stories that Daniel goes through, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and so forth, and all those little things that they end up going through because they defy the king. They keep defying the king of Babylon, and they keep finding themselves in these messes all the time. You know, same with Joseph and so forth. They have these stories where they're doing the same thing that Paul's kind of talking about here. In other words, I'm not going to live my life according to your traditions and your philosophies and your commandments and your decrees. Because your decrees, your ways, your commandments are burdensome. And they're something that I keep, and they're contrary to me. And I can't keep those. The commandments of my God I can keep because He already told me I could. But it's the commandments of men that I can't keep. And so we get to Daniel chapter 2, verse 13. And here's the first occurrence of the only two times this word shows up. Daniel 2:13. Go back to 12. For this cause the king was angry and very furious and commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. And the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they sought Daniel and his fellows to be slain. So the decree to go out to kill Daniel and his fellows is dogma. The word decree there in Greek is from dogma. So see, now what is it? In other words, this wasn't a commandment of the kingdom until they wanted someone to be killed, and then they added that. They made a decree. They did the same thing with the fiery furnace and all those things. They did the same thing, if you remember, in the days of Esther, when they wanted to kill Mordecai and all the Jews. They came up with their own decree, which is going to be our second one here we're going to read in just a minute. In order to destroy the Jewish people is the only two times that this word translated as blotting out of the ordinances was against us appears. The other one is in Esther. I have a note here at Daniel 6 verse 12. Let me read that real quick. I have no idea why I have that there, so if it means nothing, we'll go on, my friends. Daniel chapter 6 verse 12 said, okay, same thing. Then verse 11, Daniel 6 verse 11, get some context. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. Then they came near and spoke before the king concerning the king's decree. Hast thou not signed a decree that every man shall ask a petition of any god or man within 30 days, and so on and so forth? And that has to do with Daniel being thrown in the lion's den. Now we have, remember, another thing that Daniel, a little scrape that Daniel finds himself in, not based upon keeping or not keeping the Torah, but because of man's decrees. And so we go to Esther chapter 3, verse 9. Esther 3, verse 9. These little bitty skinny Bibles. Okay, Esther 3, verse 9. You all know the story of Esther. Here we're going to have the only other occurrence of this word that most religious people think is talking about the Torah being blotted out. Not only is it not talking about the Torah, but it's talking about something that's actually, in context, used to destroy the people of God, and particularly the Jewish people here in our scriptures. Esther chapter 3, verse 9. If it please the king, let it be written, there's our word. It's translated in English as let it be written, that they may be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business to bring it unto the king's treasuries. And so once again, there's a decree going to be put out by the king in order to destroy the Jewish people. And that is dogma. Torah, once again, is never called dogma. Nowhere in the scriptures. But what is dogma, once again, is the things that are added by man to the Word of God. And that is what Paul is constantly having to deal with in the book of Colossians. And so we go back to Colossians, since that is our context here. And now it says, which was contrary to us, having taken it out of the midst, or out of the way, nailing it to his cross, having spoiled principalities and powers, he made a show of them openly, triumphing over them in it. Now what we're going to do next week as we come back is we're going to discuss these things in a little more detail, because now he's going to make an open show of him destroying the enemy, the enmity, the same kind of character, if you will, that's in Ephesians chapter 2 in the middle wall of partition. There's an enmity being destroyed. Nowhere in the Bible, once again, are God's commandments, any of them, ever called the enemy or the enmity. The one that's called the enmity is Satan, Hasatan, all of his doctrine, all of his teaching are the ones that he's referring to. And so we'll continue this next week. So in the meantime, as we always say, cling to your roots that your days may be long and that you will prosper in everything you set your hand to do. Peace be unto you. Shalom Aleichem. Bye.